Welcome back to the Impact Driven Leader podcast. This is your host, Tyler Dickerhoof. So excited that you're joining in today, tuning in, that you downloaded or you went to YouTube to watch the live video. Man, there's always a little bit more. There's the facial expression. There's the demonstration that comes. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about that. My guest, Andrea Pacini, is the current head of Ideas Stage UK. He is the author of an upcoming book. It will be released in just a couple weeks on July 18th called The Confident Presenter. When I learned about Andrea and we connected, and I knew that, man, this would be a fun conversation to have for leaders, about leaders, and encouraging leaders, because leaders are presenters all day, every day. You don't have to be a speaker. You don't have to be a salesperson to be a presenter. I'm presenting to you right now. Whenever you lead and you're interacting with your team or anyone else in your organization, inside, outside, you're presenting. And how do you do it well? That's what Andrea and I are going to discuss today, what we're going to share with you, what we're going to go through. And I hope that you take some really key nuggets away from this conversation. I'm going to give you a couple brief highlights right now. And I want to start with this one. It's always the audience's presentation. All right, I'll catch you back at the end of this conversation and we'll wrap it up and put a little bow on it, send you out the door. Andrea, thank you so much for joining me. Man, I'm excited for this conversation, excited that we're connected, that you have a book coming out, which we're going to be talking about. But before all of that, I want to talk about yourself and, for me, purpose and alignment and understanding how we got to where we're at. The origin story per se is so important for our message. So I'd love to hear from you, kind of this Italian national who's living in the UK, but has this desire to help people, help leaders communicate better. I want to find out where that came from.
Thank you, Tyler. Great to be here. And sure, so the reason why I do what I do as a presentation coach, the reason why I'm so passionate about public speaking is because when I was a little kid growing up in Italy, I grew up in a family of very small business owners. My parents have always been running their own very small business together. They still do. And so as a kid, I saw the challenges because raising 4 kids while trying to run a business is not easy. But I also saw their spark, their entrepreneurial mindset, their proactive approach to life. And so that's why, Tyler, I always wanted to be an entrepreneur, to run my own thing. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, in reality, that remained a dream for a long time, because before doing what I do now, I tried many things. I started many projects. All of them failed. But it was useful because in that process, what I realized was that there are so many great ideas that fail, not because of the ideas themselves, but just because of the way we present them. Mm-hmm. And that's why then, to cut it short, eventually I became a presentation coach. That's why my mission is to stop great ideas from failing just because of the way we present them. My mission, Tyler, is to help hundreds of thousands of impact-driven leaders, as you call them, share their message so they can grow their business, increase their influence or reputation, advance their careers, make a bigger impact, depending on what their objective is.
So the initial thought that hits me as you say that, and this idea that great ideas do not live on, do not grow, do not develop because we don't do a good job presenting them, sharing them, describing them. And yet then we can stop and look at, there's a lot of really, really, really bad ideas that grow and blossom and become major movements because people are so masterful at presenting them. And I think this again, thought that it isn't the idea that moves people. It's the ability to connect and communicate and simplistically deliver it to where people take action. And you talk a lot about that in your book, the confident presenter. And one thing that really stuck out to me, and I believe this, and probably the avenue I want to go down first, is understanding it's not about you. We talked about that earlier, but as a presenter, I see many business leaders do this themselves. They think, I hold all the information. It is my job to hold that and then go dump it on people instead of sharing it or understanding where the audience is and being able to take them on the journey with them. So as a leader listening in, and maybe they're in that position where they're trying to gain followers, they're trying to help people in their organization flow with them, what's the first thing that you really share with them to say, hey, get this right first?
Here is the first thing. There are a couple of things we need to think about, but the first one is this. When you communicate your ideas, when you speak in public, when you give a presentation, we need to understand that it's not your presentation. It's always the audience's presentation. Before we went live, you told me, Tyler, leadership is not about you, it's about them. The same is true when it comes to communicating your ideas. It's their presentation, not yours. It's always the audience's presentation. Think of a presentation as a present. If I want to give you a present, it's your present, not mine. And so I need to make sure that I know you so that I can buy something that you like. A presentation is very similar. When you give people a presentation, it's their presentation, not yours. And so you need to make sure that you know your audience definitely before you open up PowerPoint or any other presentation tool. It doesn't make any difference. But also before you start thinking about your message, your idea, what you want to communicate. That depends on the audience. Now, I'll give you and our listeners a very practical way to do that. You have a presentation coming up. The very first thing you should do before you do anything else, before PowerPoint, before even thinking about your message, start with what we call the ABC of preparation: audience, burning needs, context. ABC. So you need to take some time, even if it's just a couple of minutes, but do take some time and ask yourself some questions about the audience. Who are they? Their burning needs. What do they really need? What do they expect from your presentation? And also the context. For example, is it one-to-one? Is it one-to-many? How many? Is it in person? Is it online? That's the context. If we have time, Taylor, because I don't want to go too long,
Please.
but can I give you an example of something that happened to one of our clients in the past that illustrates the importance of starting with the audience?
Absolutely.
All right. So I'm thinking of Marie, one of our clients. Marie is an executive. She's an expert in leadership. And she was invited by an association in Finland to give a talk about leadership. She's from France and she was super excited. It was one of her first international speaking opportunities. So she prepared really well. She knew her message. She told us that she prepared 50 beautiful slides. And also, she rehearsed, she practiced properly. So she was ready to go. She flew to Finland the day before the conference, then arrived there on the day half an hour before the audience because she wanted to make sure that she had time to set things up. And when she was about to connect her laptop to the screen, she realized that there was no screen. So a little bit of panic, she went and asked the organizers, assuming that they would say, "Oh, sorry, Marie, now we are going to find a screen for you." But what they did instead was they started laughing. They started laughing. And so she says, "Why are you laughing?" And they say, "Look, Marie, you want to show 50 slides, but actually, you've been invited to give a talk to the association in Finland of blind people." Blind people. Now, I know, Tyler, it's an extreme example. It sounds like a bad joke, but it happened for real. Now, the lesson for us is that Marie was very well prepared, apart from one thing. She didn't know her audience. She didn't even take the time to translate the name of the association from Finnish to French, and she would have realized that perhaps there was no need to have 50 beautiful slides. So for us, for leaders who want to make an impact, then the lesson is that if you want to make sure that your communication, your presentations are relevant to your audience, which is the most important principle of all, then before we do anything else, we need to remember that we need to start with them, with the audience.
Yeah. Yeah. The image, the thought, again, besides the fact that they can't see the slides, right? In so much of our audience, whoever we speak to, they can't see the slides that we have or the perception. And so sometimes we have so much there that they're lost, whether they realize it or not. But the piece that I think of from a leadership, and I'm speaking a leader who is working within their organization, small team, big team, you're presenting to 5, you're presenting to 500. To me, it's irrelevant. It does not matter. But how often leaders find themselves in that spot where they believe that the audience is with them. They believe that the audience just should know. The reality is the audience has no idea all the other things the leader knows. And so if we make that misassumption, and again, metaphorically aligning this, the fact that leaders fall into the same spot as Marie every single day. I want to present all of this. Maybe it has so much context, but my audience is just worried about right now as we're going through the world. Hey, what's this summer going to be like? What's that going to do our business? We have economic things going all around. And I, as a leader, am trying to talk about, the next expansion in 2024. And they're like, you're speaking French and I'm Finnish. It just does not match. And yet it's pretty, laying that out as a grand metaphor, but yet that happens to leaders all the time. And with that, people just like, well, this isn't for me. I'm out. He's not speaking to me. It's not related to me.
So true. And Tyler, one of the main reasons why that happens, and this is the number one problem or obstacle in communication, the reason why that happens is because often we are talking about people, business professionals, business leaders who are very good at what they do. They know their stuff, they have experience, they have expertise, but they struggle to communicate, to present their ideas really effectively. And what happens is that often we know so much about our subject and we are also so close to it that, first of all, we think that everything is important.
Mm-hmm.
And so we think that we need to talk about everything. We also think that what we are communicating is simple and clear and engaging for the audience. Often, whether we are aware of it or not, the experience from their perspective is the opposite. It's confusing. And in communication, it's very simple. If you confuse, you lose. You lose your audience. You lose their attention. You lose it, not just during the presentation, but you lose it for good.
Yeah. All right. In the middle of this conversation, I just want to take a moment to invite you, if you're not a subscriber to the Impact Driven Leader newsletter, to go to the Impact Driven Leader /free course. You're going to get the 4 days to maximum impact video series as well. Submit you into my email sphere where you can learn more about the Impact Driven Leader community. So now back to the rest of the episode. Yeah. Well, my belief, and I've learned this and I've experienced this, the most important thing for a leader to do, presenter to do, is connect. And you can't spend too much time connecting with, that's an adage that many listeners have heard from me. And again, I believe in, if we're talking about communication and presenting, man, that's first and foremost. You talk about that with Marie. I needed to connect deeper with who the audience was, what they really wanted, and how it could be presented to them to actually lead them there. There's a point there that you made that was part of my notes, is too often leaders are too close to be able to, I would say, I guess, objectively present. And so we think that, oh, everyone knows what we know, or we're afraid that they need to know everything we know in order to grasp it. And the reality is, if there's trust and connection and credibility, people just need to know that you know and understand enough so they can go with you.
This is when you say that you've emphasized the fact that we are so close that we find it hard to imagine what it means not knowing what we know. That's the number one problem in communication. It's called the curse of knowledge. The Heath brothers talk about in their very famous amazing book, Made to Stick, how to make your ideas
Great book.
stick. Yeah, fantastic book. They talk about the curse of knowledge, which is our inability to imagine what it means not knowing what we know. It's our inability to put ourselves in the audience's shoes. And it's very easy to fall into this trap, the trap of the curse of knowledge, unless we find a way to get access to some sort of an external perspective. Now, that external perspective could be, if you really want to get it right, work with a presentation coach. It could be that you prepare a presentation and then you practice it, you deliver in front of friends and colleagues, you get the feedback. It could be that you just deliver it on Zoom and then you watch the recording, which may feel uncomfortable, but that will give you the external perspective for you to be aware. And awareness is key. If you want to improve your communication skills, the first step is we need to be aware of what's going on, of certain dynamics where we may need to improve on. And then once we are aware, it's just a matter of continuing the journey, practicing. But if you practice while you are aware of what needs changing or improving, that makes a big difference.
One, you kind of taking that and saddling it with this idea of presentations often end up being a speaker talking at people. I believe this. If the speaking that I get to, I'm not a speaker. I'm not this like grand like performer. I don't want to be that. I want to be a conversationalist. This is exciting me. The guest, the conversation, the podcast that I have, it's just a conversation, right? It's I have notes. Yeah, I'm prepared, but I don't know what you're going to say and what I'm going to say, but we lead this conversation. And I believe the most powerful presentations are very prepared, but connected conversations. Being able to say, I've seen people do this like, 15 minutes through a presentation, realize the audience is not where you want to go, and just whatever slides I had, throw out the window. But I'm confident enough, I'm comfortable enough knowing that everything I need to know, that if they're not going with me, whatever I have next does not matter. And I need to just I need to be on their level, not get down to their level, but I need to be on the same level I'm communicating with. And I think that's really hard for a lot of leaders, because either their own confidence or this idea that, well, leadership means that I'm a step above someone. I can't be with them.
Tyler, the key word you used is conversation. I agree with you 100%. We can talk about it. You also mentioned something at the beginning of your question, which I would love to perhaps later explore, because it's one of the most important principles. You said often speakers talk at their audiences.
Yeah.
Whereas we need to do something else. We can talk about it later.
Yeah.
But for now, conversation. Now, a very common mistake I see is exactly what you've described, that most presentations are one-way lectures, one-way communication. So we think that our job as leaders, as presenters, is we've got an hour, half an hour. Okay, for half an hour, I speak, you listen. No, a presentation should be a designed conversation. And the key word is, yes, conversation, but also designed, which means that you want to design the conversational elements of the presentation, and you want to do it in advance. So for the audience, it has to feel, and it will feel like a spontaneous conversation, which is great. But you, as the presenter, you've designed those moments of conversation or interaction in advance. And the reason why that's important is because if you don't do that, you will lose your audience's attention. This is demonstrated by a number of studies. For example, if you are presenting in person, then it doesn't matter how good you are as a presenter. It doesn't matter how interesting or relevant your topic is. Your audience's attention will tend to drop after about 10 minutes. If we are presenting or communicating online, it's even less than that. So the audience's attention is a bit like the sand in an hourglass. If you think about an hourglass with the sand in an hourglass runs out after about a few minutes. But it's very easy to just flip you over and start again. The same is true when you are presenting, which means that it's not up to the audience to work hard to pay attention. It's
Yeah.
up to you as the presenter to work hard to gain their attention and to keep it high. And the best way to do that is to go from one-way communication to a design conversation. So you've got your topic, you know what you want to talk about. A very practical thing you can do is go back to your storyline, to your presentation structure, to your content, and ask yourself, okay, this is what I want to talk about. From time to time, what could I say? What could I ask? There are many possibilities that in such a way that can involve the audience into the conversation. It could be as simple as asking a question, inviting them to think about something you've just said and share their thoughts with the person sitting next to them. It could be inviting them to type something in the chat. If it's a Zoom webinar, for example, it could be assigning some breakout rooms or in-person small groups to work on an exercise. But it's key that we need to move away from one-way lectures and we need to create designed conversations. That's how you keep your audience's attention throughout.
Well, I think that dovetails perfectly to what you mentioned. It's when you're talking at people, you don't want them to be involved. It's like, I'm here, I'm going to do my thing, you're going to listen, and then we're going to get done. And there's an element where I see this happening for many presenters that they're like, well, I have a 30-minute slot and I'm going to pack in as much information that 30-minute slot as I can. And if I go 35, well, okay. And we've all been to those conferences. We've all been to those events. And rarely is it the, presentation that, you give them 30 minutes and they're done after 25, but yet they use that time to engage and interact and actually make it way more enjoyable. There's not many speakers, presenters think about that. But the ones that do exactly what you did. They said, oh, I have 20 minutes of content. Okay, I can use stories to guide people along. I can make sure I have plenty of analogies. I can make sure that the audience is involved, and that 30 minutes is going to go by like that. But they're going to be left with something very connected and very actionable instead of just a bunch of information that I tried to cram into 30 minutes.
True. And first of all, as a presenter, you never want to go long. So if they give you 30 minutes, you should finish within 30 minutes. And actually, you should plan for maximum 90% of the time you have available. So they give you 30 minutes, you have to finish within 20, 25 minutes. Absolutely. Never go long. And then now
but that's not what people do.
No. Most people, Tyler, most presentations suck. That's the reality. Now,
let's be honest here, okay?
the other thing is, okay, let's talk about speaking at people, at the audience. Now, a lot of people, that's what they do. They talk at them, they speak at them. In reality, the secret to great presenting is to always talk to your audience about them, even when you're talking about you, your idea, your project, your product, your service, whatever it is. So rather than talking at them about you, you always want to talk to them about them, even when you're talking about you. This is something that also Emma Ledden talks about in her book, The Presentation Book, which I've interviewed for our podcast, the Ideas on Stage podcast. Now, I'll give you an example. What does that mean? If I tell you we have 158 offices all over the world, great. I'm talking at you about me. If I tell you we have 158 offices all over the world so that you can get access to a customer support team wherever you are, I told you the same thing, but I talked to you about you, even if I'm talking about me. So that's the difference, and that's the key to great communication.
Yeah, love it. Well, it invites that person to be the hero. We talked about this earlier, the influences in our life that have, Donald Miller, who's done such a good job. There's others too that say, don't make yourself the hero. And, I mentioned this earlier that when we were chatting is that so often I see leaders that use the example you just used. I want to show you, hey, we have 158 offices. I'm the hero because that's what I've done. That's what I've done for you, but I'm the hero because I've risen from that, instead of converting it like you did. And all of a sudden, you're not the hero, you're the guide, because I've already done that, but I've done that for you. So that way you can get whatever we deliver, or you can have the opportunity to solve your problems. And it's as simple. I think the words that you used is really great for someone to understand. Hey, switch from being the hero, switch from you're the top of the mountain, instead of like, no, I'm just someone to help guide you up Everest. I'm with you to just help you through that, foggy little pathway. And when we do that together, man, we're all better off. We're all going to go somewhere different, but it's not about me getting there and you end up wherever you end up.
This is so crucial. We are not the hero of our story. The audience, or depending on what your context is, your client, your listeners are the hero of the story. Now, in practice, how can we do that? So I'll give our listeners a practical approach. So say, for example, that you wanted to, in a presentation, you wanted to share a case study or a success story from, say, for example, that one of your previous clients. So you don't have to be an entrepreneur. You are a leader within an organization. Maybe you have a client, and you want to use that case study or that client success story when presenting to a potential client. Now, rather than talking about how great you are, a great way to make the client, your client, the hero of the story, not you. You said, Tyler, as Donna Miller explains, our role is the role of a guide that gives the hero a plan, an idea, whatever it is that helps them achieve success. The way to do that is you want to follow a 4-step framework: setting, complication, turning point, resolution. That's a proven story framework. It's a narrative. So that's by itself, that has value because it's engaging. It's a narrative setting, which could be as simple as time and place. Now, for example, if we go back to Marie's story before, I started by saying, for example, 3 years ago, we worked with a client in Paris, in France. Her name is Marie. So if you start with a bit of a setting, time and place, 3 years ago, Paris, that's it. That the audience knows that you are about to tell them a story. Could be as simple as that. Then the crucial thing is that you want to talk about the complication, the problem, but not your complication. It's the complication from the perspective of your client. Your client is the hero of the story. What was the problem, the challenge that your client was experiencing? After that, turning point. And in the turning point, that's where you come along. But you come along, as you said, Tyler, not as the hero. You come along as the guide that gives the hero a plan, an idea, a product, a service, whatever it is that you give them that helps them solve that complication and achieve success. And in the resolution, that's another key bit. In the resolution of your case study or your client success story, you don't talk about how great you are. You talk about how great your client is. You want to put a spotlight on the success of your client. Now, of course, if you do that indirectly, what the audience is getting is that if your client has experienced that kind of resolution or success, of course, it's because of what they've done with you. But you don't have to talk about that. That
Yeah.
happens indirectly. And
Yeah.
you can, by doing that, you can communicate your ideas, your work, your values in a much more effective and elegant way.
Well, I think about conversations. Enjoyable conversations have that. Unenjoyable conversations is when people are boasting and they're telling about how great they are and what they've done and what they've accomplished. People don't care, right? I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. I want to hear either how does it impact me? How can I grow from that? Or what can I learn about the journey, right? And that's part of, I think, storytelling is this, right? Setting to complication, turning point to resolution. That's all a journey. And we all learn through journeys in whether it's a leader of a Fortune 50 company that's sitting in front of people that over the last 2 years, many people have said, I want to know you're real. And don't tell me that you didn't have to deal with adversity the last few years, but tell me the journey with it and what decisions you had to make. And I will absolutely link arms with you. And we see that in our world today. The leaders that have done that and done that so well, they have people that are lining up to work their businesses. And the ones that have said, we have all the answers, we will, so, it's all about we, it's, about I instead of, it's the leadership as we. People are like, I don't care about you. You don't care about me. I don't care about you. I'm out. I'll go find somewhere else. And we're in that midst. And I think that's where this presentation ideology and framework and belief is so powerful, because we have so many employees that are working and they're asking for leaders to lead them and not point at them. Lead them and say, hey, join us, come with us, guide, let me guide you. And whether the solution for our customers or the solution what we provide to you as a workplace or a place to live out your purpose, right? So we're living it right now.
Yeah. And if your leadership, presentation, or communication fails to inspire your team, your colleagues, your partners, then they won't be motivated to follow you and deliver on your strategy. And you talked about journey, taking the audience on a journey, and the best way to do that is, as you've anticipated, storytelling. Storytelling is one of the most, maybe probably the most powerful thing we can do in communication.
It's
And
historical.
yeah, exactly. And even especially in a business context, then we need to tell stories. We need to include stories in our communication, in our presentations. This is not just for TED Talks or for big talks at conferences. As you said, Tyler, you are speaking in front of 5 colleagues. Storytelling. Now, when we say storytelling, we are not talking about telling a once upon a time type of story. We're not talking about including an emotional story. It could be, by the way, depending on what the context is, but it doesn't have to be an emotional story. A story could be an example, it could be a case study, it could be something that happened to you, your personal story, if it's connected to the point you want to get across. Because, by the way, that's the point of using storytelling. Storytelling is not about telling a story for the sake of it. It's about telling a story because we want to make a point, because that story is there to illustrate a particular point. And when we do that, the audience will remember the story and what that means. So it could be a personal story, it could be stories about other people, stories about a colleague of yours, it could be stories about brand success. Again, if you have a client that has already successfully implemented the idea or the recommendation that, or maybe another department within your organization that has already successfully implemented the recommendation that you have for another department, that's a story. If we think about it, there's always a story to tell. The problem with most business presentations is that they are 99% facts and figures, and then if we are lucky,
Yeah.
1% is story. It's a bit unbalanced. We
Yeah.
should turn this around. So if we tell more stories, that's the most powerful thing we can do to make our presentations, our communication more original, enjoyable, and memorable.
So I want to kind of, I guess, land the plane or end or cap it with this. You shared that. I believe that. I think if we look back thousands of years, millennia, stories have moved people, not facts. Why do leaders, presenters that are so heavy on facts, when you work with them, why do they shy away from stories, instead rely on facts? Why do you see that is what do you see the main rationale or reason why they go there? And then how do you help them see a different pathway?
The There are a couple of reasons. One reason is that it's the usual thing of we've done this thing this way for so long, and we've always done it this way. So we've always approached presentations with just facts and figures, just opening up PowerPoint, putting together some slides without thinking about taking the audience on a journey from A to B. So without thinking about these things, including storytelling. So we've always done it this way. And that's one principle. Now, the other thing to consider is that we think wrongly, but we think that if we want to convince somebody of something, influence them, persuade them, we think that the best way to do that is with facts and figures. But it's not. Because if you think about it, if I want to convince you, say that we have different opinions on something. Like, for example, before we got started, we were talking about soccer, the Champions League final.
Yeah.
You think maybe about one team, I think about another. If I want to convince you that I'm right and that you are wrong, if I share with you a fact, for sure, you will find, if you do your research, you will find your own fact, your own data that contradicts what I said. We see everywhere in the world, in many different areas, including health and
Yeah.
science.
Yep.
I
Yep.
share a fact, you will find your own fact that supports your thinking. Whereas if we think about it, if I share a story that illustrates a particular point, then you can't argue with the story. It's impossible to argue with a story. It's a story, it's something that happened. A story, an analogy, a metaphor. So that's another thing. And that's why this is so much more powerful. And by the way, it's not about using stories and not using facts and figures.
Yeah.
Good communication is where you touch both areas of people's brain. We all have at different levels, but we all have if we want to simplify, the logical side in our brain, and you touch the logical side with facts and figures, with data. Super important. But if you only do that, you are missing one side of people's brain. You also want to touch the emotional side, and you do that with stories, examples, anecdotes, analogies. And what we need to try and do in our communication, we need to have the right mix of logic and emotion. It's a bit like a seesaw. If you think about a seesaw, when two
Yeah.
kids, a seesaw is parallel to the ground only when nobody is using it. As soon as two kids start playing with it, it goes up and down. Now, a seesaw, which is parallel to the ground, is like a presentation which has an equal mix of logic and emotion. Now, it doesn't have to be like that. It could be 50-50, or it could be that if you're giving a very technical presentation to a very technical audience, maybe you could go like 80% or even 90% facts and figures, but you do want to include 10% of emotional things, storytelling. What you never want to do is 100% facts and figures and nothing from an emotional perspective.
So I want to take that little analogy. A great presentation does what kids do on a seesaw. It goes up and down and up and down. A presentation that's not going to really impact people is stuck. It's when one kid's heavier than the other and he's not pushing. Sorry, you're not going anywhere. You're stuck up in the air, and I'm like, how can I get down from here? But to me, that's the image that comes to me. Is like good presentations. You're going through that seesaw, which you mentioned earlier in regards to speaking with the audience, having that conversation. That's that seesaw going back and forth, back and forth. That's what's enjoyable. That's why you get on a seesaw.
You picked up this analogy, and it's not a coincidence, because in addition to stories, analogies are also
Yeah.
super powerful in communication. If we pay attention, great communicators use analogies all the time. again, for the Ideas on Stage podcast,
Yeah.
some time ago, I interviewed John Pollack in the US. John is the author of a great book, Shortcut. He's an expert on analogies. He says that an analogy is a shortcut from a communication perspective. He was one of the presidential speech writers for Bill Clinton. And he told me that the best way to explain something new, which could be your idea, whatever it is that you want to get across, is to attach it, to connect it
Yep.
to something that the audience already knows and understands. When you make that connection, that's when learning happens. So I would always encourage, especially those who need to communicate complex ideas, technical ideas, is to think about, okay, can I use an analogy to make it easier for the audience to understand it? I'll give you an example, Tyler. Some time ago, I was watching a video on YouTube where you may know in the US, he's famous worldwide, Neil deGrasse Tyson, the
Yeah.
astrophysicist.
Yeah.
So he talks about science, which can be very complex and technical. And he was answering some questions, was taking some questions from the audience. And one question was, Mr. Tyson, what do you think about life in the universe beyond planet Earth? And he believes that the chances that there is life in the universe beyond us is very high. But instead of using technical language, complex ideas which would have not worked for that particular audience, we go back to making it relevant to the audience. He used an analogy, and I still remember the analogy because that's what happens in our brain. We remember the analogy or the story and what that means. And he said, imagine that you are in a boat. It's just you are in a boat, in a very small boat. It's just you on the ocean, and you have a glass with you. And with your glass, you take some water from the ocean, and then you look at your glass and you say, okay, there are no whales in this glass. Therefore, we can assume that there are no whales in the entire ocean. If you assume that there is no life in the universe, it's like making this assumption here that just because there are no whales here, we can't see any whales, then there are no whales in the entire ocean. And we all get it, right? We can all relate to the idea of being on a small boat in the
Yeah.
ocean, and we get it. So when you connect something that the audience is not yet familiar with, your idea, or it could be something that they don't understand yet, something they don't believe in yet. When you connect that with something that they already know, understand, accept, when what happens is in our brain, subconsciously, the audience will think, okay, if this is true, then that must also be true. Then Tyler's idea must also be true. And that's the power of an analogy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's one of those things I find myself so often speaking analogies, and I think it's just a individual trait I have, but yet I believe it is masterfully powerful. I think it's a unique gift that I don't think about. It just happens. But I do know, as you've said, that when you can do that, man, it connects all the dots. I'd even go back to, pondering. Say he did answer that. Neil did answer that in an audience that was astrophysicists that knew about it. How impactful to make it so simple if he still used that same analogy. Because even the most educated astrophysicists, they would be challenged to say, hadn't thought about it that way. That's an interesting take, because it completely removes them from going back to what we talked about earlier. When you're so close and know so much about the information, it's, having life by looking through a microscope, that you need to look through the telescope to see a broader picture. And I believe that's what analogies do for people when it's done right. It can really help them see, oh, never saw it that way. It's kind of like we were talking about Inter Milan and Man City. I have to look at it. There's a possibility. They have to play the game. Okay. I
Exactly.
hope it turns out in my favor. We'll know by the time this releases, but it is what it is.
Exactly. And going back to what you've just said, great communicators simplify.
Yeah.
They simplify. Using analogies is one way to do that, but in general, everything is in service of simplifying our ideas for the audience. That's what great communicators do. They use simple language, simple sentences, simple words. And what a lot of business leaders do instead is the opposite. They use complex language, acronyms, industry specific terms that they understand, not necessarily the audience. And that's what a lot of people do, especially business leaders, because they think that if they do that, then they sound smarter and more
Mm-hmm.
credible. The opposite is true.
Yeah.
If you look at people, leaders who you admire, who you consider smart and credible, what they do is the opposite. They replace complex language with simple language. And when I say that we need to speak simply, I'm not suggesting that we need to oversimplify our ideas, our topics. It's not about dumbing it down. It's about finding and using language that as many people as possible in our audience can understand.
Man, Andrea, thank you so much. This has been great information that I think is powerful for anyone, wherever you're leading, especially in businesses in front of people presenting. No way, shape, or form is it not applying. And I think the simple always moves people. And it's when you can make great ideas simple, people will latch on and they become brilliant ideas.
Thank you, Tyler. I really enjoy this conversation, and I hope that your listeners have enjoyed it when, and depending on when they watch it live or the
Yeah.
recording, where I hope that they enjoy as much as I did, and then the most important thing, I hope that your listeners have found it useful as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrea. One key piece of our conversation that we had was that the audience is always in the driver's seat. It's not the presenter. It's not about me. It's not about you. It's what value can the audience gain? Where do they fit in the story? I'm a large proponent and fan of Donald Miller's work, whether it be Hero on a Mission. We've talked about that before. Building Your Story Brand, that book that Andrea and I mention and refer to. And it's that we're just the guide. Leaders are guides. The person listening, engaging, they're really who the story is about. And if we focus on that, man, that's when we really help people. It's always the audience's presentation. Here's another point that I really took from our conversation. I agree with totally. If you confuse, you lose. The moment you confuse someone, if you're watching your audience, the moment you confuse them, all of a sudden they glaze over, they start fiddling around. I've heard this from other speakers. They start checking their phone, right? You notice that. How do you get their attention? One other piece that Andrea mentioned that I think is so powerful is the curse of knowledge. If we anticipate that everyone's going to know what we know in the circumstances and arrangement that we know, we've lost our ability to connect, guide, and lead the audience. We really need to understand and see they don't know what we know. So how can we feed them spoonfuls? Not patronizing, but understanding how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. How do we lead people by using the analogies and metaphors and stories, parables that people for millennia have used to present and share information? See, it's about the journey. It's about the process of helping people go from where they're at now to some other place. And just like Andrea mentioned about his client who showed up at the event totally unprepared, the biggest thing a leader, presenter, a speaker can do is know their audience. I want to know you better. Thank you for being here. What I'd love if whatever feedback, whatever comments, whatever reviews, share them. I'd love to get an email, tyler@tylerdickerhoff.com. Let me know what value you got from this episode. How did it enlighten something in your life and realize, man, as a leader, I'm really just as much a presenter as those people that stand up on stage all day long. Leaders are presenters. And the more confident the more sure in who we are, what message we have to present, and the better package we put that in order to guide, give information, not overwhelm, but help people through the process to want to know more, man, that's when leaders really make an impact. Thanks for tuning in. Till next time, have a good one.